Years ago, a lonely farmer who lost everything found a young native girl freezing at the train station, a chance meeting that would change both their lives forever. In a world full of prejudice and pain, their fragile bond became a story of hope, courage, and survival against all odds. Tell us where you're watching this video in the comments below. And if you love stories of the Wild West and unexpected friendships, don't forget to subscribe. Now, saddle up and dive into their journey. I don't know what drew my eyes to the station that evening. Maybe it was the way the sun bled into twilight, the sky bruised in shades of purple and gold, or maybe it was the restless wind that seemed to whisper of things left undone. For years, I had lived with my head bowed, my words buried, my heart wrapped in layers of old grief, and yet something made me look up, and in that moment, everything changed. She sat alone on the weathered bench, a small, hunched figure swallowed by the shadow of the station house. The wind tore at her thin shawl, and even from where I stood, I could see how her body shivered against the cold. Her skin was dark, her hair tangled and black, framing a face far too young to hold such emptiness. I remember the way her stillness cut through the noise of my thoughts, as if the prairie wind itself had stilled to watch her. I had no reason to stop. For years, I had taught myself to keep moving, to let the world pass me by. After Sarah died, after we buried our baby son in a grave too small and too quiet, I had built walls around my day's walls of chores and silence and dust. The town's judgment had long ceased to matter to me. Their pity was a thing I neither wanted nor needed. And yet, as I watched that girl, I felt the stone in my chest shift, as if the cold had finally reached something deeper. The wind at my back felt sharp, almost urging me forward. I stepped closer, my boots loud on the wooden planks. She did not look up. I could see her hands, small and raw from the cold, curled tight around her knees. I hesitated. Every part of me whispered that this wasn't my burden, that I had nothing left to give. But grief had taught me to see what others ignored, and in her stillness, I saw something achingly familiar, the fragile defiance of someone who had already lost too much. I remember standing there, the wind catching my breath, my mouth dry. The town behind me felt distant, the sky above too wide. And in that space between, there was only me and the girl and the unspoken weight we both carried. Without truly deciding, I stepped closer. My voice felt rough, like it hadn't been used in years, which wasn't so far from the truth. I spoke softly, so as not to startle her, though she flinched all the same. Her eyes met mine, thin, dark, wide, and ancient with fear, and something in my chest ached with memory. I told myself it was only for the night, that I would bring her to the ranch, give her warmth and food, and in the morning find someone who could help her. But even then, as I reached out my hand, I think part of me knew that she would not be leaving so easily, and neither would the piece of my heart that had stirred awake for the first time in years. Her hand was cold and hesitant in mine, like a sparrow unsure of shelter. We walked to where Dusty stood tied, the wind biting at us both. As I helped her onto the saddle, her small frame stiff with fear, I felt the first crack appear in the shell I had built around my life. And as we rode out of town, the sun finally gone and the prairie turning to shadow, I caught sight of a few faces on the boardwalk, watching whose faces twisted by curiosity, suspicion, and something colder still. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't care. The ride to the ranch was long and silent. The darkness grew heavy around us, broken only by the soft creak of leather and the distant cry of a coyote. Her back was pressed against me, her shivers running through my own bones. I kept my eyes on the trail, the familiar path home, and let the memory of Sarah and our child flicker quietly at the edge of thought. When we reached the cabin, it stood small and stubborn against the dark prairie. The fences I had mended 100 times, the barn leaning like an old man in the window of it, suddenly seemed less empty. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood smoke. I lit the lamp and its light painted the lines on my hands, the walls I had built and rebuilt in silence. She stood near the door, her eyes wide as they searched the room. I built the fire, my movements slow and deliberate, so she would see there was no danger here. When the flames caught, the shadows softened, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. She couldn't have been more than 14 or 15. Her cheeks were hollow, her clothes threadbare. There was a bruise along her jaw, darkening beneath the flickering light. And yet, in the way she held herself chin tucked, eyes wary but unbroken, I saw a strength that felt older than either of us. I gestured for her to sit by the fire. She obeyed silently, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. As I heated water on the stove, my mind turned over what little I knew and what I feared. An Apache girl, alone in a town that had never needed much reason to hate. And me, a man known only for my grief and my silence. I cleaned the cut on her brow, my hands clumsy from disuse. Her gaze never left my face. And in that quiet moment, something passed between you, something fragile, like the breath before a word is spoken. I made us a meal, though my supplies were meager. She ate slowly, carefully, as though each bite might be taken away. I watched her, and in the watching remembered what it felt like to care whether someone ate, or slept, or simply lived. That night, I lay awake long after the fire burned low. I listened to the small sounds of her breathing, the wind against the walls, and the echo of my own heartbeat. Outside, the prairie stretched silent and endless, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root, a fragile, unspoken promise that neither of us yet understood. In the darkness, I told myself that I had only given her shelter, but deep down I knew better. It had been so long since hope had dared set foot on this land. The next morning, the light spilled across the cabin floor in slow golden stripes, dust dancing in the beams like tiny spirits. I lay still for a moment, listening not just to the wind outside or the distant low of cattle, but for the quiet breathing that meant I was no longer alone. It had been years since the silence of dawn had been broken by anything but my own restless thoughts. I rose carefully, my joints stiff from years of hard living and restless nights. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a small shield. Her eyes tracked me silently, cautious, but no longer wild with fear. That look reminded me of a horse the first day you try to place a saddle on its back, entrusting, but not yet bolting. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and indifferent. The fences I had built seemed smaller now, and the chores that once filled my days felt different with another set of eyes watching. I offered her a tin cup of water. She took it with both hands, drinking carefully, as though afraid to waste a single drop. I realized then just how long it must have been since someone had shown her even this small kindness. I moved about the morning routine as I always had, feeding the animals, checking the windmill, gathering firewood. Only now, I found my gaze drawn back to the cabin door, half expecting her to vanish like a half-remembered dream. But when I returned, she was still there, standing by the window, staring at the expanse of land that had once been my prison and my solace. I couldn't bring myself to ask her to help. Instead, she offered. Wordlessly, she followed me outside, her small frame wrapped in that same thin shawl. Together, we fed the chickens. Her hands moved carefully, as though each grain of feed mattered. Watching her, I felt something loosen inside me, a slow unwinding of the years I had spent believing nothing could change. The land had shaped me into something hard and quiet, and I saw now how it had tried to do the same to her. But where it had buried me in silence, it had taught her to listen to the wind, the shifting sky, the rustle of unseen animals. In those first days, she spoke little, and I spoke less. Yet in that silence, something passed between us, an understanding that words would have only clumsily named. At night, after the chores, we shared what little food I had. Beans, salted pork, stale biscuits, softened in coffee. She ate without complaint, her eyes meeting mine only when she thought I wouldn't notice. Sometimes as the fire burned low, I caught her tracing shapes in the ash with her finger patterns that meant nothing to me but seemed to hold memories only she could see. The cabin, once an echo chamber of my regrets, felt different now. The empty chair across from me was no longer empty. The fire seemed warmer. The nights, though still long, were not so crushing. Yet with each passing day, I felt the weight of the choice I had made settling on my shoulders like fresh snow on a sagging roof. I knew what the town would say, what they were already saying. Willow Creek had never needed much of a reason to sharpen its whispers into knives. An Apache girl in my care? To them, it would be proof of my madness, or worse. But each morning when I saw her standing there, thin shoulders squared against the prairie wind, the noise of the town seemed as distant as thunder on the horizon. On the third evening, as the sun bled into another bruised dusk, I found her near the corral. Dusty, my old horse, stood patiently while she traced a hand along his neck. The horse, who had never cared for strangers, stood still under a touch. There was something in that quiet exchange of recognition between two creatures who had known fear but chose gentleness instead. Later, by the fire, I found my voice. I spoke of Saranat, of her death, but of her laughter that had once filled these walls. I spoke of the small garden she had planted by the cabin, the stubborn rose bush that somehow bloomed each spring despite the wind's cruelty. The girl listened, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. She said nothing, but her silence was not empty. It was a listening silence, as though my words were seeds she gathered carefully in her heart. It had been so long since I had spoken of Sarah aloud. The words tasted strange, like a language half forgotten. Yet as I spoke, I felt the ache in my chest shift, not gone, but no longer so sharp. In those quiet nights, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a place where life might grow again. One morning, a week or so after she arrived, I caught sight of the dust rising on the road from town. My stomach tightened with a familiar dread. Two riders approached, their figures small against the vast sky, but unmistakable in posture and purpose. I knew them before I could see their faces. Sheriff Brody and Martha Higgins, the self-appointed conscience of Willow Creek. I wiped my hands on my trousers, feeling the old fear crawl up my spine. Years of keeping my head down had taught me that trouble always comes wearing a familiar face. They stopped in front of the fence. Brody, broad-shouldered and jowl-faced, shifted in his saddle. Martha sat rigid beside him, her eyes sharp as a crow's. They did not speak at first, only let their gaze drift to where she stood near the cabin door, her small form framed by the worn boards. The air seemed to thicken between us, the silence heavy with judgment. Brody cleared his throat. "Calloway," he said, his voice flat as dry earth. "Folks are talking." I nodded, my mouth dry. They always do. Martha's lips tightened into something brittle. "An Apache girl? In your home? Think of what you're inviting here, Thomas." I felt my pulse quicken, but my voice stayed calm. She was alone, freezing at the station. No one else would help her. "That should have told you something," Martha snapped, her words as sharp as winter wind. "They bring trouble, Thomas. You know that." Brody shifted again. "People are worried. Might be best you bring her to town. We can see to her." I pictured the girl in the sheriff's office, alone under their staring eyes. I saw the cold bench, the empty promises, and something in me, long buried, rose to meet them. "She stays," I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange and my ears firmer, heavier than it had been in years. "She's no danger to anyone." Brody's gaze hardened, but I held it. The silence stretched, the wind tugging at my hat. "Suit yourself," he muttered at last. "But don't say we didn't warn you." They turned their horses and rode back toward town, dust curling behind them. I watched until they were specks on the horizon, the ache in my chest replaced by something fierce and unfamiliar. When I turned back to the cabin, she was still there, watching. Her eyes met mine, dark and unreadable, but for the first time I thought I saw something softer than fear, something closer to trust. That night, as the fire cracked and the wind rattled the window, I lay awake thinking of what I had done. I had invited trouble onto my land, broken the fragile peace I had built from silence and solitude. And yet, as I listened to her quiet breathing across the room, I felt a warmth that the fire alone could not explain. For years, I had believed I had nothing left to lose. But now, I knew better. The stone in my chest was still there, but it had begun to shift. carved by the simple presence of a girl who had known loss deeper than most hearts could bear. In the darkness, I wondered what price we might both pay for the choice I had made. But for the first time, the thought of tomorrow did not fill me with dread. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the walls, and inside, a flicker of hope warmed the spaces I had once thought forever cold. Days blended into weeks, measured not by calendars but by chores, sunrise to sunset, and the quiet rhythm of shared silence. At first, she followed me like a shadow, never too close, never too far, always watchful. I spoke little, unsure of what words could bridge the distance between a man broken by grief and a girl who had seen too much for her young years. But slowly the distance between us shrank. I taught her how to mend the fence lines, where winter storms had battered the posts, her small hands surprisingly quick and sure with the hammer and wire. Together, we fixed the windmill, its old blades catching the prairie wind once more, drawing water from the stubborn earth. The sound of that water filling the trough was more comforting than any hymn I could remember. She never complained, not about the heat of midday or the cold mornings that stung our breath white. Sometimes, after a day of work, I would glance up and catch her watching the horizon, eyes distant, as though listening for voices only she could hear. And though she spoke little of her past, the quiet weight of it hung around her like a shawl. In the evenings, we sat by the hearth, the fire painting the walls in restless light. I would whittle small figures as birds, once even a clumsy coyote, and hand them to her without ceremony. She took them gently, turning them over in her hands, tracing the grain of the wood as though it held secrets. Once, I caught her smiling at a tiny horse I'd carved, a fleeting thing that vanished almost as quickly as it came, but it stayed with me like an ember. I began to speak more, not because I thought she needed my words, but because the silence between us felt different, now less like an empty room and more like a space waiting to be filled. I told her of my wife Sarah, whose laughter had once softened these hard walls, and of our son who had lived only long enough to hold my finger in his tiny hand before slipping away. My voice shook, but she did not look away. Instead, her gaze steadied me, as though saying, "I know." She shared, too, not with long stories, but with small offerings, the name of a flower in her language, a way to read clouds to tell if rain would come, how to walk softly enough to see deer before they saw you. Through her eyes, the land I had thought I knew felt alive again, full of signs and whispers I had never heard. Yet beyond the fence lines, trouble brewed. I felt it in the stiff greetings at the general store, the averted eyes, the half-heard murmurs that coiled like smoke. One morning, as I loaded supplies onto the wagon, I caught sight of Martha Higgins across the street, speaking in hushed tones to two other women. Their eyes found me, sharp as knives, and in that moment, I knew the town had turned. At night, lying awake in the dark cabin, I weighed what I had invited onto my land. The fear of losing what little piece I'd rebuilt gnawed at me, but each morning when I saw her by the corral or tending the chickens, that fear quieted. What kind of man would I be if I sent her away? The thought of her walking the road alone, chased by hunger, cold, and worse, was more than I could bear. Spring moved across the prairie, greening the grass and bringing storms that rattled the roof. One stormy night, lightning split the sky, thunder rolling so close it shook the floorboards. I found her standing by the window, eyes wide, breath quick. Without thinking, I placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not flinch. Together, we watched the storm pass, the fury of wind and rain giving way to silence, broken only by the soft drip of water from the eaves. That night, as the fire burned low, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. She told me of her village, small and tucked in a fold of hills, of her mother who sang her to sleep, and her father who taught her to ride. Then came the sickness, the soldiers, the hurried flight that scattered her family like leaves in a gale. Her words trembled, but she did not cry. Neither did I. Instead, we sat together in that fragile space where pain was shared, and for the first time, I realized that grief had not just built walls around me, it had built them around her too. Days lengthened into warm evenings, and she began to move through the ranch not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She rose before dawn to help milk the cow, brought water from the well without being asked, and even coaxed Dusty to let her brush his coat, something he had never allowed another soul but me. Watching her, I felt something inside me shift a tenderness I had long thought buried under the weight of years and sorrow. One morning, as we mended a section of fence, she paused and pointed to a hawk circling overhead. "They come when the mice move," she said, her voice low but certain. I watched the hawk ride the wind, and in that moment, I saw the land as she did, alive, connected, speaking in signs and silences. But the town would not leave us in peace. Word spread, carried by wagons and whispers. One afternoon, Mr. Davies, the storekeeper, leaned in close as I paid for flour and coffee. "They're talking about sending the sheriff again," he murmured, voice low, "saying it ain't right, you keeping her there." His eyes were kind but worried. "Careful, Thomas." I thanked him and left, the weight of the town's gaze following me back along the dusty road to the ranch. That night, I kept watch longer than usual, the rifle within reach. I knew the town's fear could turn to anger, and anger needed little excuse to become violence. Yet each dawn still brought the small, stubborn grace of another day together. In the mornings, I would see her by the rose bush Sarah had planted, touching its leaves with the same care she gave the animals. Once, I found her humming a tune I did not know, soft and mournful, but somehow hopeful too. It felt as though she was singing life back into this place, note by note. And though words between us were still few, they came easier. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in colors that made even old scars ache with longing, she turned to me and said, "This place, it feels like it remembers." I nodded, understanding more than words could say. The land did remember joy and sorrow, laughter and loss, and now it remembered us too. The turning point came quietly. One day, as we rode back from checking the far pasture, she slowed her horse, looking out over the land. "I don't feel so lost here anymore," she said. Her voice was steady, though soft. I looked at her, at the strength in her shoulders and the light that had returned to her eyes, and realized how far we had both come. That night, by the fire, I found myself telling her something I had never spoken aloud. I thought I'd stopped caring about anything beyond this land, but you reminded me what it means to care. My voice cracked, the words heavy with truth. She did not answer with words, but her gaze met mine, steady and warm, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between use of promise, perhaps, or simply understanding. But even as our bond deepened, the town's anger grew. Martha Higgins came to the ranch one morning, her mouth a tight line, eyes cold as river stones. She did not dismount, only sat in her saddle, looking down on us. "Thomas Calloway," she said, voice sharp. "You're tempting fate, keeping her here. You'll bring ruin on yourself, on this town." I did not reply. There was nothing to say that would change her mind. After she left, the girl stood beside me, her expression unreadable. "They hate me," she said, voice almost a whisper. I shook my head. "They hate what they don't understand." Her gaze met mine. "And you?" I hesitated, then spoke the truth. "I don't understand everything either, but I don't hate you." As summer deepened, so too did the knowledge that our quiet life could not remain untouched forever. Yet in the evenings, as the prairie wind turned cool and the stars blinked awake, we found peace not in forgetting our pasts, but in sharing them. For years, I had thought loss had taken everything from me, but sitting by the fire, watching the shadows dance on her face, I saw how wrong I had been. Grief had hollowed out a space in me, and into that space, against all odds, had come something unexpected, hope. In the end, it wasn't grand words or promises that bound us together. It was the quiet acts, a shared meal, a mended fence, a carved wooden bird offered with rough hands and received with gentle ones. Outside, the prairie remained as vast and merciless as ever, But inside the small cabin, we had begun to build something neither of us had dared to hope for, a home. Summer laid its heavy hand across the prairie, turning the grass to gold and baking the earth, until even the stones felt warm to the touch. The days stretched out long and dusty, and still we worked side by side, two souls tied together not by blood, but by a shared stubbornness to keep moving forward. In those weeks, the ranch changed in small but unmistakable ways. Flowers she planted near the porch began to bloom, stubbornly pushing through the dry soil. The chickens, somehow soothed by her quiet presence, laid more eggs than I'd seen in seasons. Even Dusty, my old horse, grew less skittish, letting her stroke his muzzle without flinching. But beyond our fences, the town's resentment festered. Word reached me through the supply runs that some folks called it unnatural, that they claimed I was a fool or worse for keeping her under my roof. Once, while I loaded feed sacks into the wagon, a man I barely knew spat on the ground at my feet, his eyes hard and hateful. He didn't say a word, but the silence spoke plenty. Still, each evening when we returned to the ranch, the land seemed to offer its own kind of refuge. We had fallen into a quiet routine. After supper, she would sweep the floor or tend to the fire, while I'd sit near the hearth, carving small animals or shapes from leftover wood. Sometimes she'd watch me work, and sometimes she'd hum a tune that spoke of hills and rivers I'd never seen. I never asked her to stop. One night, after days spent mending fence posts in heat that left sweat tracing salt on our skin, she surprised me. "Why do you stay?" she asked, voice low, her eyes on the dying fire. For a moment I didn't answer, caught off guard by her question. Then I said what had long sat unspoken in my chest, because leaving would mean forgetting, and forgetting would mean losing them twice. She nodded, and in that nod I saw she understood. Her loss was different, but the ache was the same. As summer ripened, the prairie turned restless. Storms gathered over the horizon, and so too did the threat of the town's anger. One afternoon, returning from the creek, we found a message burned into the side of my barn. "Send her away." The letters were rough, blackened scars against the wood, still smoking at the edges. She stood beside me silent, her face pale but resolute. I wanted to curse the world that had made a child responsible for the fear of grown men. Instead, I placed a hand on her shoulder. "They don't decide who belongs here," I told her, though my voice trembled at the edges. Her eyes met mine, and in that quiet, I saw something fierce take root. Not defiance, but a kind of fragile hope. That night, sleep was slow to come. Memories pressed at the edges of my thoughts, Sarah's laughter echoing in these same rooms, the tiny hand of my son gripping my finger for the first and last time. I wondered what they would say if they could see me now, if they would see failure or forgiveness. The question stayed long after the fire burned to embers. In the mornings, life demanded our attention. Fences sagged, goats wandered, and coyotes tested the limits of our resolve. One dawn, she came to wake me breathless, to say the sheep had broken through the west pasture. We spent hours driving them back, our voices hoarse, sweat stinging our eyes. At midday, we paused on the ridge, the prairie rolling out before us in dusty waves. "It looks endless," she whispered. "And yet, it isn't," I replied. She turned to look at me, a question in her eyes, but said nothing. Little by little, her English grew stronger. Words she had spoken only in whispers now came with a surer voice. She began to name things aloud: willow, dust, sky. And sometimes, late in the day, she taught me words in her own language, the sounds strange on my tongue but soft in my ears. One evening, after we returned from town, I saw her stop by the rosebush near the porch, Sarah's rosebush. It had nearly withered the summer after Sarah died, as though mourning in its own silent way. But this year, stubborn shoots of green had returned, and even a few pale blooms had opened. She crouched beside it, tracing a petal with gentle fingers. "She planted this," I said. She looked up, and for the first time asked, "Did she like flowers?" I nodded, the memory sharp and sweet. She said they reminded her that beauty could grow anywhere, even here. The girl seemed to hold that thought close. Days later, I found small wildflowers tucked into cracks of the cabin's porch, as though she had left tiny offerings of color against the wood's grayness. Yet not all days ended in quiet grace. One afternoon, as we loaded sacks of grain at the store, 3 men stood across the street, watching. Their stares were open, unblinking. When I met their eyes, one of them, a big man with a scar down his cheek, spat into the dust. "Ought to be ashamed, Calloway," he called out, his voice like gravel. "Ain't right what you're doing." My hands clenched around the sack, but I forced them to loosen. "I'm feeding someone who needed help," I said, my voice low but steady. The man laughed, mean and sharp. "Help?" he echoed. "Or hiding something?" His words hung in the hot air, drawing the eyes of others. I turned away, knowing no answer would change what they'd already chosen to believe. On the way home, she sat beside me on the wagon seat, silent, her hands gripping the edge. At one point, I reached over, covering her hand with mine. She didn't pull away. That night, after supper, I spoke what had weighed on my chest since the barn was burned. "If you wish to leave, I won't stop you," I told her. "You don't owe me anything." She looked at me, eyes dark and steady. "And if you wish me to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question cut deeper than I expected. "I don't," I said, the words scraping raw from somewhere deep. Relief, small but clear, passed over her face, and in that look something inside me eased. As summer wore on, the land offered its own quiet lessons. We watched a hawk circle for nearly an hour, patient beyond understanding, before finally diving and rising again with its prize. "Wait long enough," she said, "and even the sky answers." I wondered if that was true for hearts as well. And still the ranch demanded its due. One morning, Dusty limped back from the pasture with a deep cut on his leg. Together we cleaned the wound, our hands moving in quiet coordination. When Dusty shuddered with pain, she spoke to him in her language, voice soft and sure, and somehow the horse stilled. Watching her then, I felt an ache. I couldn't name, a strange mix of fear and gratitude, as though I had stumbled upon something fragile and precious. Then came the drought. For weeks, not a drop of rain fell. The grass turned brittle, the creek thinned to a trickle. Each evening I scanned the sky for clouds that never came. The girl carried buckets of water to keep the rosebush alive, though its leaves drooped in silent protest. I told her we might lose it, but she only shook her head. "Not yet," she whispered. One night, as the heat pressed even the walls into stillness, I woke to find her sitting outside, legs drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the stars. I joined her, lowering myself onto the rough steps. "Can't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head. "The stars feel closer here," she said softly. "Where I come from, they seemed so far away." I followed her gaze upward, where the sky shimmered with silent light. "Maybe they are closer," I murmured. She smiled, the faintest curve of lips, and for a moment, the night didn't feel quite so heavy. Yet peace never lingers forever. One morning, while she gathered eggs, I saw a figure riding hard toward the ranch. Dust curled behind the horse like smoke. As the rider drew closer, I recognized Sheriff Daniels, his face drawn tight, eyes shadowed by his hat. He reined in hard, dust swirling around us. "Calloway," he began, voice clipped. "Town council's had enough. They want her gone." His gaze flickered to her, then back to me. "They say it's for her safety, but we both know what they're really afraid of." My chest tightened. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then they'll make you choose, her or this land." His words landed heavy between us, dust settling in their wake. After he left, I sat on the porch steps, staring at the horizon until the sun slipped low. She stood quietly beside me. Finally she spoke. "They will never see me." Her words were calm, but behind them lay a sorrow too deep for years to measure. "Maybe," I said, my voice rough, "but that doesn't mean you don't belong." She didn't answer, but she sat beside me, shoulder barely brushing mine, and together we watched the prairie fade into dusk. That night, I dreamed of Sarah standing in the doorway, the wind stirring her hair. "Don't turn her away," she whispered. "You've lost enough." I woke with my heart pounding. The fire burned low, its coals glowing faintly in the dark. Morning would come, and with it decisions that could not be undone. But for now, in the hush before dawn, we still had this: a shared silence, a stubborn hope, and the memory of a promise made, if not in words, then in the quiet beating of two hearts that had refused, against all odds, to remain alone. The prairie, once a place of quiet refuge, had begun to feel smaller, as if the horizon itself were drawing closer, hemming us in. Every morning, I woke with a tightness in my chest that didn't leave until the sun dipped low behind the western hills. And even then, it never left entirely. The sheriff's warning had changed something in the air. Though the fences still needed mending and the goats still needed tending, each task carried a new weight, as if each nail I hammered into the fence was holding back more than wandering livestock. It was holding back the world itself. One morning, as we hauled water from the creek reduced now to a thin, stubborn ribbon, I caught her pausing, bucket in hand, staring into the slow-moving water. "It remembers," she whispered, her voice almost lost to the breeze. "What does?" I asked. "The creek," she said. "It remembers what it was, even when it's only a trickle." Her words settled deep into me, echoing in places I hadn't known were still hollow. At night, the wind turned restless, rattling the windows and stirring the memories that slept uneasily in the corners of my mind. I found myself dreaming not just of what I had lost, but of what might yet be taken. One evening we sat on the porch steps, watching the sky fade from rose to violet. The rose bush by the door, once nearly dead, had put forth two new blooms, fragile, pale things, but alive nonetheless. "It shouldn't have survived," I murmured, half to myself. She looked at the petals, then at me. "Sometimes the heart survives what the world says it can't," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. In that moment, I saw her not as a child in need of shelter, but as something stronger. A soul shaped by loss, yes, but also by a fierce, unspoken will to keep standing. But strength could not stop what was coming. A week after the sheriff's visit, a noise woke me in the dead of night, a sharp splitting crack that echoed across the yard. I stumbled from bed, heart pounding, and threw open the door. Flames clawed at the side of the barn, smoke curling into the dark sky. She was already there, barefoot in the dust, throwing water from a small bucket. Together we fought the fire, coughing and choking, until the flames died down, leaving only smoldering black scars against the wood. In the ruin, I found a rag doused in oil, and beside it, scrawled in ash on the barn wall, "Not welcome." We stood in the gray dawn, the smell of burned timber thick in the air. She wiped soot from her cheek, her eyes wet but unblinking. "They won't stop," she whispered. I swallowed hard, my throat raw from smoke and anger. "Then neither will we," I said, though even as I spoke, a cold fear settled deep in my bones. The next days blurred into work and watchfulness. Every creak of the windmill, every distant shout from the road set my nerves on edge. Yet life, stubborn as the prairie grass, went on. We fixed the barn wall as best we could, hammering new planks over scorched ones. She painted over the burn marks, her brush strokes careful, deliberate, as if covering a wound that could still be felt beneath the surface. Sometimes I caught her glancing toward the horizon, her gaze distant, as though measuring how far she could run if she had to. Once I asked, "Do you ever wish you'd kept going that day, kept walking past this place?" She turned to me, her eyes steady. "No," she said, without hesitation, "because then I wouldn't have seen what hope looks like." Her words struck deeper than I let on. For so long, I had thought of myself as a man made of old scars and empty rooms. To her, though, I had become something else, and in her gaze, I caught glimpses of the man I had been and perhaps could be again. Yet even hope has its price. One afternoon, as we drove into town for supplies, the silence on the main street felt heavier than usual. Folks who once offered curt nods now turned away, muttering under their breath. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Avery, avoided my eyes as he tallied the goods. When I reached for the bag of flour, he pulled it back. "Best you take your business elsewhere, Thomas," he said, his voice tight. "Troubles followed you, and folks are nervous." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Behind me, she stood small and silent, her eyes lowered. "We can pay," I managed to say. "Ain't about payment," Avery muttered. "It's about peace." The word tasted bitter in my ears. We left empty-handed, the town's quiet rejection settling over us like dust. On the wagon ride home, she stared at her hands in her lap. "It would be easier," she said, "if I wasn't here." My grip tightened on the reins. "Easier isn't always right," I replied, though the words felt thin against the weight of her sadness. That night, the wind rose, howling through the gaps in the walls. I lay awake, replaying every moment that had led us here. The first night I found her, the mornings we shared, the laughter that had slowly returned to my porch, and the fire, always the fire. Before dawn, I got up, stepping outside into the gray chill. To my surprise, she was already there, standing barefoot in the yard, the hem of her dress stirring in the breeze. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured. "Me neither," I admitted. We stood together, the world around us hushed, the first light painting the sky in soft strokes of gold. At that moment, the prairie felt endless again, as it had when I first came here with Sarah, full of promise, untouched by fear. "When the sun rises," she said softly, "it's like the world starts over." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "And sometimes," I said, "we get to start over too. But starting over isn't something the world grants easily." 2 days later, Sheriff Daniels rode up again, dust trailing behind him. His expression was grave, shoulders heavy. "Town council met again," he began, his voice low. "They've given you until the week's end to send her away." His gaze met mine, pained but unyielding. "If you don't, they'll come themselves." "And do what?" I demanded, though part of me feared I already knew. "Drive her out," he said quietly. "Or worse." His voice caught, just for a moment, before he looked away. After he left, I sat on the porch staring at the land I had spent a lifetime tending. She stepped beside me, her small shadow merging with mine in the morning sun. "They won't stop," she whispered again. I closed my eyes, the choice tearing at me from inside. "I know," I whispered back. The next days felt both endless and fleeting. We mended what we could, gathered what little might be needed if we had to flee. Yet we also truly lived in those stolen moments. We cooked together, her laughter breaking through my worry like sunlight through clouds. In the evenings, she taught me more words in her language, and I carved a small wooden figura hawk, wings spread to give to her. When I placed it in her hands, she traced the carved feathers gently, her eyes soft. "For hope," I told her. She nodded, holding it close. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, she asked, "What did your wife see in you?" The question startled me, but I answered honestly. "She saw something I'd long stopped seeing in myself," I said. "That I could still love, still be loved." She fell silent, her gaze thoughtful. "Then maybe that's why I found you," she whispered. Her words stayed with me, even as sleep finally took me. The week's end came closer with every sunrise. On the last night, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Stars crowded the sky, the moon hanging low and heavy. "What if we left?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the night breeze. "Started over somewhere else." Part of me longed to say yes, to harness the horses at dawn and ride until the world forgot our names. But the ranch was more than land. It was memory, promise, and grief woven into every fence post and floorboard. "I can't," I whispered, "and I won't ask you to stay and suffer for it." She placed a hand over mine, small and warm. "Then we face it together," she said. Morning came, pale and cold. From the porch, I saw riders gathering on the distant road, more than a dozen, dust rising behind them, They came slowly, deliberately, as though the weight of what they intended demanded no hurry. As they approached, I felt her step closer, her shoulder brushing mine. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. I wished I could say the same. And as they crossed onto my land, hearts pounding, breath held, the sun broke free from the horizon, painting the prairie in gold and shadow, and casting us, for one fleeting moment, as nothing less than unbreakable. They rode onto my land with dust on their boots and judgment in their eyes. The morning sun threw long shadows behind them, turning each man into something larger, almost mythicos of a history that had always hung heavy over this place. At the front rode Sheriff Daniels, his hat pulled low, jaw tight. The others fanned out behind him. Townsfolk I'd known most of my life. Men I'd traded with, sweated beside at barn raisings, nodded to on Sunday mornings. But today, their eyes were cold as river stones. She stood beside me, small and silent, the carved hawk still in her pocket. I could feel her breath catch as they stopped a few yards away, horses shifting nervously, leather creaking in the quiet. "Thomas," the sheriff began, voice hoarse from dust and doubt, "we asked you to do what's right, to spare this town more fear." He hesitated, glancing at her. "You didn't." I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the dry earth. "What you're asking isn't right," I said, my voice steady though my heart thundered. "It's cowardice, dressed up as safety." A murmur ran through the riders. Faces tightened. One man, Eli Peterson, whose grandfather had built the church spat in the dirt. "This ain't about hate, Thomas," he growled. "It's about keeping what's ours safe. Folks don't want her here." "Folks," I echoed, the word bitter on my tongue. "Or you?" Eli's eyes narrowed, but he held his tongue. Sheriff Daniels shifted in the saddle, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool morning. "Don't make this harder," he pleaded. "Send her away. Today, or we do it." Beside me, she lifted her chin. "And if I go?" she asked softly, her voice steadier than mine had been. "Will your hearts be lighter? Will the dead rest?" Her words hung in the still air, sharp as glass. No one answered, because the answer, unspoken, was no. The silence broke when a rider at the back, a younger man I didn't know well, called out, "Then let's be done with it." He spurred forward, his horse snorting, hooves tearing at the dry ground. My hand went to the old rifle leaning against the porch rail, though I hadn't fired it in years. Before I could move, Sheriff Daniels raised a hand. "Stop," he barked. The young man reined in, glaring. The sheriff turned to me, his voice cracking. "Thomas, please. For everyone's sake." In that moment, I saw not a lawman, but a man caught between what he knew was right and what his neighbors demanded. I saw his fear not of her, but of the choice before him. "I won't send her away," I said quietly. The riders stirred, anger sparking like dry grass to flame. Eli urged his horse forward, stopping just short of the steps. "Then you bring this on yourself," he spat. And like that, it was done. The line was drawn. They turned and rode off, leaving only churned earth and a silence so deep it felt alive. After they left, the morning felt strangely bright, the sky too wide, too blue. She sank onto the porch steps, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. I sat beside her, the old boards creaking. "They'll come back," she whispered. I nodded. "I know." She drew the carved hawk from her pocket, running a thumb over its wings. "Do you think hope has wings strong enough to carry us?" she asked. The question held a raw vulnerability that cut deeper than any threat. "Sometimes," I said, "hope flies because it must, not because it can." We spent the day making small repairs that felt as useless as patching a sinking boat. The barn door still hung scorched and crooked. The goat pen needed new boards. Yet with every nail, every board, it felt like we were saying, "We will not go quietly." As the sun set, I found her in the old kitchen garden, where weeds had claimed the rows. She was on her knees, coaxing a stubborn green shoot from the hard ground. "It shouldn't grow here," she murmured, dirt smudged on her cheek. "So dry. Too many stones." She looked up at me. but it tries anyway. Her quiet defiance stirred something in me, something older than anger, pride, perhaps, or simply love. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The wind moved through the cracks in the walls, whispering doubts in every breath. I rose and stepped outside. She was already there, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, staring at the stars. "Where I'm from," she said, "we believe the dead become stars. They watch us, guide us, judge us sometimes." "Do you think they see us now?" I asked. She nodded. "And I think they remember what it is to be lost." We stood in silence, the prairie stretching endless and empty around us, the stars fierce in their watching. The next morning brought something worse than riders. A letter, left by the gate, weighted with a stone. No name, but no need for one. I unfolded the coarse paper. The words were few, scrawled in a blunt hand. "You have until sundown tomorrow. After that, no mercy." She read it over my shoulder, her breath catching. "They mean it," she whispered. I knew, yet leaving felt like defeat, and staying felt like doom. All day we prepared, though for what, neither of us could truly say. I cleaned the old rifle, my hands trembling at the unfamiliar weight of it. She gathered what little food we had, packing it into a sack that looked pitifully small. At noon we sat under the porch's thin shade. "Tell me about her," she said suddenly. "Your wife." The question startled me. It had been years since anyone had asked. "She loved wildflowers," I began, my voice cracking. "Would pick them every spring, even when there were chores to do. Said beauty shouldn't wait." "And you?" she asked softly. I waited, I admitted. Waited to say things I should have. Waited for more time. I swallowed. And then she was gone. She laid her hand over mine, small and warm. "She'd be proud," she whispered. As the sun dipped, the world seemed to hold its breath. I walked the fence line one last time, the boards rough under my hand, each nail a memory. The house stood behind me, weathered but stubborn, and beside it she waited. "They'll come soon," I said. She nodded. "Then let them come." Night fell, sharp and cold. In the distance, torches flared, small pinpricks of fire that grew into a line. Horses snorted. Men's voices carried on the wind. They stopped at the gate, the sheriff at their head. Even at this distance, I could see the sorrow in his eyes. "Thomas," he called, voice ragged. "Last chance." I stepped forward, rifle in hand, though my heart rebelled at the thought of raising it. "No," I called back. A pause. Then Eli's voice, harsh and eager. "Then let's finish this." The riders moved, torches bobbing, the earth trembled under hooves. Beside me, she did not flinch. In those final moments, the world seemed to slow. I saw the porch where Sarah had stood, smiling in the early light. The barn, blackened by hate yet still standing. The stubborn rosebush by the door blooming where it shouldn't. And her, the girl who had walked out of the dusk carrying more sorrow than anyone her age should, and yet had given me something I thought forever lost. As the riders drew closer, the wind rose, scattering dust and ash. She turned to me, eyes clear and fierce. "No matter what happens," she whispered, "you gave me home." I opened my mouth to reply, but the words caught in my throat. Then the riders reached the yard, and everything fell into fire and fury. The night shattered like glass the moment they surged through the gate. Torches lit the darkness like angry fireflies, casting long, jittery shadows across the dry earth. The pounding hooves of horses echoed like thunder rolling over the prairie, a warning storm of flesh and fury. Faces I knew twisted by fear and hate, their eyes wild and unforgiving, their voices hoarse from months' snow, years of bottled resentment. Beside me, she was a statue of quiet strength, wrapped in that thin blanket, clutching the carved hawk I'd given her. Her eyes didn't waver. They burned steady, alive with something raw and unyielding. I caught my breath. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was standing at the edge of something greater than myself. The sheriff's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "This is your last chance, Calloway. Bring her in peacefully, or we do this the hard way. I raised the rifle slowly, feeling the weight of it settle in my hands, a familiar cold comfort. The barrel was worn, scarred with years of disuse, but steady. The same rifle that had once kept my family safe, now pointed toward a town that had forgotten what safety meant. "No," I said, voice calm but firm. "She stays." A yell erupted from the crowd, a sound that tore the night apart. Eli Peterson, the man with a scarred face and a voice like gravel, spurred his horse forward. "Then you're asking for trouble." Shouts exploded. Gunshots cracked through the night, sharp and sudden. Horses reared and screamed, men shouting commands or curses or prayers that were swallowed by the wind. I ducked behind the porch post, heart pounding like a wild drum, the rifle raised and ready. A bullet thudded into the wood beside me, splinters flying. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil rattling through my arms. A man cried out, clutching his shoulder, staggering back. The rest faltered, their confidence shaken by the sudden resistance. She was inside, locked behind the cabin door, her breath loud in the silence that filled the brief pauses between gunfire. I could feel her heartbeat through the thin walls, strong and steady. The fight was no longer about the land or fear, it was about survival, about claiming the right to exist, to be seen, to be protected. The night stretched on, bullets cutting through the darkness, men falling, others retreating. The fire from the torches flickered uncertainly as the riders pulled back, their anger boiling into grudging respect, or maybe just fear. I stayed where I was, rifle lowered but still ready. When the last horseman disappeared over the ridge, the prairie fell silent again. The stars, unmoved by human fury, shone down with a cold light. The dawn came slow and gray, dragging the weight of what had happened through the still air. The ranch was quiet except for the low groans of men nursing wounds, the creak of broken fence posts, and the occasional soft sob from the cabin. I found her on the porch steps, wrapped in the blanket, eyes red but unbowed. She held the carved hawk close to her chest, fingers tracing its worn edges like a talisman. "You didn't have to fight," she whispered, voice cracked. "I did," I said simply, "because no one else would." She looked up, eyes wide. "I'm not afraid of dying." "That's what scares me," I admitted. We sat together in silence, the first fragile light of day creeping over the horizon, painting the sky with muted oranges and purples. The world felt raw and fragile as if at any moment it might shatter or heal. Over the next weeks the dust settled, but the tension did not. The town kept its distance, whispers trailing after us like shadows. The sheriff no longer came riding with threats, but his eyes held a wary calculation. Nahili and I carved out a fragile peace on the ranch. She learned the rhythm of the land, her movements growing sure and strong, her quiet presence filling the empty spaces with something like hope. I found myself talking again about Sarah, about the land, about the silence that had swallowed me whole. Sometimes she would listen, sometimes she would share stories of her people, their traditions, the spirits that lived in the earth and sky. One evening, beneath a sky thick with stars, she showed me how to find water by reading the patterns of the grass and the wind. I watched her, amazed by the depth of her knowledge, the grace in her steps. But the past was never far behind. One night, as we sat by the fire, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. I froze, rifle in hand. It was Eli Peterson. He stepped forward, face grim, eyes tired. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "Heard what you did out there. You stood your ground." I nodded, still wary. He sighed. "The town's been talking. Some still don't like it, but others, they're starting to see." Nahili didn't move. "See what?" she asked. "That you belong," Eli said quietly. It was the first time those words had been spoken aloud. The following months were a slow, painful dance. The town's coldness softened, edges worn down by time and the stubbornness of our existence. Neighbors began to nod instead of glare. The general storekeeper even offered a smile now and then. Still, the shadow of prejudice lingered like a stubborn fog. Through it all, Nahila and I built a life not the one we dreamed of, but one we fought for. We grew together, learning to trust where once there was only fear. She taught me to listen to the land in new ways, to see beyond the horizon to the stories it held. I shared with her the small joys Sarah had loved, the wildflowers, the warmth of the fire, the quiet moments that stitched a life together. On a late summer afternoon, as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, we rode out together on Dusty. The sun was warm on my face, the wind tangled in her dark hair. I felt the stone in my chest shift, its edges softening. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were something new, a fragile bloom rising from the harshest ground. And in that moment, under the vast, ancient sky, I realized sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought with rifles or anger. They're fought with hope, with the courage to stand when the world tells you to fall, with the quiet strength to offer shelter to the lost, and with the unyielding belief that even in the darkest places, two broken souls can find a way home. The prairie dawn crept quietly over the horizon, the soft light spilling gold across the land like spilled honey, touching the tips of grass and bending wildflowers awake. I woke before the sun, the weight of the night's silence heavier than any bullet or threat. Sitting on the rough wooden porch, I watched the world hold its breath, waiting, just like me. Beside me, Nahili stirred slowly under the blanket, her dark eyes blinking open to meet the faint pink light. For a moment, the ghosts between us fell away, the years of grief and suspicion melted into something fragile, something almost like peace. We both knew the road ahead would be rough. The town was still watching, still whispering. The old grudges, the hate, didn't vanish overnight. But something inside me had changed, not just the way I saw her, but the way I saw myself. I was no longer the broken man carved out by loss and silence. There was fire, again a stubborn, flickering flame that maybe, just maybe, could burn away the cold. Morning chores were quiet but steady. Nahili moved with a confidence that surprised me, her hands sure and steady as she gathered eggs from the henhouse, her eyes sharp and bright in the morning light. Watching her, I realized how much she'd grown, how the ranch was no longer just my refuge, but a home we shared, built together with sweat and small, meaningful moments. She was teaching me things, too, not just about the land, but about life, about resilience, about hope. That afternoon, I found her sitting by the creek, the water rushing over smooth stones, her fingers tracing patterns in the mud. She looked up when I approached, a quiet smile touching her lips. "I'm thinking about the water," she said softly. "How it finds its way through the rocks. Even when blocked, it doesn't stop. It finds another path." I nodded, feeling the truth in her words settle deep in my bones. Maybe that's what we have to do. But the world outside, our little sanctuary, was restless. The town's disapproval simmered, bubbling just below the surface. The sheriff, Brody, came riding one evening, the setting sun throwing long shadows over his grim face. "You're still stirring things up," he said flatly. "People don't like what you're doing here." I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm just living my life. She's staying." He spat on the ground, his eyes narrowing. "You're making trouble for yourself, for her." Maybe he was right. Maybe this was trouble, but it was my trouble, mine to bear. That night, the wind whispered warnings through the trees, carrying the distant sound of hooves again. My heart pounded as I grabbed my rifle, ready for whatever storm was coming. This time, it wasn't just a few angry men. It was a whole posse, guns, glinting under the moonlight, faces grim and determined. They were coming for Nahili. I stood firm, my body tense, waiting. The first shot cracked through the night, a warning and a promise. The fight was brutal. I fired until my arms shook, my breath ragged in the cold night air. Nahili stayed close, her eyes fierce and unyielding, as if daring the darkness to swallow her whole. In the chaos, I felt something shift, a fierce protectiveness, deeper than grief or fear. This was no longer just survival. It was war for a future worth fighting for. When the dust settled, they fled again, leaving broken fences and broken men behind. But the message was clear. They wouldn't stop. Days bled into weeks. The threat never vanished, but neither did our determination. Nahili and I rebuilt the fences, tended the wounded animals, and kept the fire burning through the cold nights. We shared stories by the hearth, laughter breaking through the silence like sunlight through storm clouds. She told me about her people, their songs, their dances, the sacred places hidden beneath the earth and sky. I shared stories of Sarah and my son, their smiles, their dreams, the hole their absence left in my heart. In the space between pain and hope, we found each other. The town, too, began to change. Slowly, grudgingly, neighbors stopped turning their backs. Old men tipped their hats in passing. Children waved shy hellos from dusty porches. Even Martha Higgins' sharp eyes softened just a little. The resistance wasn't gone, but the fear that once ruled the town was cracking. One afternoon, Nahili and I rode into town together. The sun was high and warm, dust swirling around our horses' hooves. Heads turned. Whispers followed. But this time, I saw something new: curiosity, maybe even respect. We stopped by the general store. Mr. Davies greeted us with a nod and a small smile. "You're making a difference," he said quietly. I looked at Nahili. She smiled back, a spark of hope lighting her eyes. Back at the ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. The land, once barren with loss, was blooming with possibility. Wildflowers spilled across the prairie, colors vivid against the endless green. Dusty carried us across the open fields, the wind tangling our hair and carrying away the ghosts of the past. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with fiery oranges and deep purples, Nahili sat beside the fire, her face glowing in the flickering light. She handed me a small wooden bird, carved with delicate care. "For you," she said softly. I took it, feeling the smooth wood warm in my hand. It was more than a gift. It was a symbol of trust, of healing, of a new beginning. The stone in my chest hadn't disappeared. It never would, but its weight had lightened. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared rhythm of two souls, wounded but unbroken. Together, we had carved out a place where light could seep in, where hope could grow. The town may never fully accept us, but here, beneath the vast, ancient sky, on this land we had fought to claim, we were home. And sometimes that was enough. The nights had grown colder, the sharp bite of early winter creeping over the prairie and into the bones of the land. The wind no longer whispered gentle secrets, but carried a harsher edge, rattling the thin glass of the cabin windows and howling through the skeletal branches of the leafless trees. The chill was more than weather, it was a reminder that change was coming, that nothing stayed still for long, especially in a place so raw and untamed. I watched Nahili as she moved through our small world, her breath a soft mist in the morning air, her hands steady as she tended the fire or fed the animals. There was a quiet strength in her that had taken root since that first day she sat frozen on the train station bench, trembling in the cold and fear. The girl who once seemed so fragile was becoming something else, something fierce and unyielding, but that strength came with scars. I saw it in the way her eyes darkened at times, shadows flickering beneath their surface, like storms waiting to break. She carried a weight that was heavier than my memories of a family torn apart, a people scattered like leaves before a windstorm, a future stolen by sickness and cruelty. It was a burden no child should bear, yet she bore it with a silent grace that both humbled and haunted me. Our bond had grown beyond mere companionship. It was a fragile thread woven from shared pain and quiet hope, stretched thin by the harsh world around us but never breaking. We were two broken souls, finding in each other a reason to keep fighting, to keep believing that life could still hold moments of light. Yet the town's resentment simmered beneath the surface like embers in dry grass waiting for a spark. One evening, as the sun sank behind the distant hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery reds, a group of riders appeared on the ridge, their silhouettes sharp and menacing against the fading light. I recognized the look immediately, the cold, hard eyes of men who had nothing but trouble on their minds. Nahili stood beside me on the porch, her jaw clenched, eyes scanning the horizon as the riders drew closer. I could feel the tension thickening in the air, a storm before the storm. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, dismounted first, spurs clinking against his worn boots. His voice was rough when he spoke. "Calloway, we've come for what's ours." I stepped forward, steady despite the pounding in my chest. "This land's mine, and so is she," the man sneered. "You think you can keep us away? You're just a broken man playing at being a rancher." "Maybe," I said quietly, "but I'm not alone." Nahili didn't hesitate. She stepped out from the shadows, her eyes blazing with a fierce light that cut through the gathering dusk. "We're stronger than you think," she said, voice steady and clear. For a moment, the men exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Then the leader laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "We'll see about that." The fight that followed was brutal and unforgiving. Bullets tore through the twilight, splintering wood and ripping the quiet prairie air. I fired with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything worth saving. Nahili was beside me, agile and fierce, moving with a deadly grace that belied her youth. The men were seasoned fighters, but they hadn't counted on the fire burning in Yuuzhan, the bond that made us fight not just for survival but for something more. When the last gunshot echoed into silence, the attackers lay beaten and broken, their threats scattered like dust on the wind. But the victory was bitter. The land bore the scars of their rage, fences torn down, barns damaged, cattle scattered in panic, and we bore the deeper wounds of knowing the fight was far from over. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on what we had become. Two unlikely companions thrown together by fate, bound by loss and a stubborn refusal to give up. Nahili taught me more than I ever expected about the land, its stories, and the strength of roots that run deep beneath even the harshest soil. She showed me how to listen to the wind, to read the language of the stars, to find healing in the smallest things. I taught her what I knew of this land, the rhythms of seasons and soil, the stubbornness of cattle, and the patience it took to coax life from dirt. Together we were forging something new, an unspoken promise that the past did not have to dictate the future. But the town remained a looming shadow, a reminder that acceptance was still a distant dream. One bitter morning, a letter arrived, its edges rough and stained with travel. I recognized the handwriting, faint, familiar, haunting. It was from the reservation, Nahili's aunt, a plea for her to come home, to return to a life bound by old customs and painful memories. She showed me the letter, her fingers trembling as she read the words again and again. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the pull of a past she could not forget, and the tentative roots she had begun to put down here. We sat together in silence, the weight of choice heavy between us. Her future stretched out before her like a forked road-on path back to the world she came from, the other forward into the unknown with me. That night, by the fire's dying embers, she spoke at last. "I'm afraid," she whispered, "of losing everything again, of being caught between two worlds." I reached for her hand, feeling the small pulse of life, the fierce heartbeat of survival. "You're not alone," I said, "and whatever you choose, you'll always have a place here." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a fierce resolve. "Then I choose to stay." The winter came hard and fast, frosting the earth and silencing the prairie beneath a blanket of white. The cold pressed against our cabin walls, but inside, the fire burned warm and steady. We survived the long nights with shared stories and quiet dreams. Each day, a testament to the stubborn spark of life that refused to be snuffed out. The town's whispers faded into the background, drowned out by the steady rhythm of life rebuilt from broken pieces. One morning, as the sun rose crisp and clear, I watched Nahili ride across the snow-covered field, her dark hair a banner in the wind, her spirit unbroken and free. I knew then that whatever came next, we had already won. Not because the world had changed, but because we had found a way to change ourselves. Together, the land stretched vast and endless before us, a canvas waiting for the colors of new beginnings. And beneath the endless sky, two souls, wounded but unbroken, rode side by side into whatever dawn awaited. Winter's grip had tightened, wrapping the prairie in a stark silence that pressed against the cabin walls and settled deep into the earth. The world outside was a pale, frozen expanse, but inside, the fire's glow flickered warm, casting long shadows that danced like memories along the wooden beams. The cold was relentless, but so was the stubborn pulse of life we had rekindled between us. Nahili moved with a quiet grace. I'd come to rely on her hands steady and sure, even when frost crept along the edges of the windows and the wind roared like a wild thing beyond the thick walls. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd sat shivering at the train station months ago. She was a woman forged by loss and resilience, her spirit tempered like the hard wood of the corral gates. I often caught myself watching her, wondering how fate had twisted our paths together, two broken pieces that somehow fit, imperfect, but whole enough to build something lasting. The town's hostility had not vanished, but it had softened into uneasy tolerance. People still whispered when we passed, eyes shadowed with suspicion, but there was a thread of respect woven through their murmurs, a grudging acknowledgement of what we had survived and the stand we had taken. Still, the past was a ghost that lingered. One afternoon, as I was repairing a fence battered by winter storms, a rider approached from the town. His face was familiar Brody, the sheriff, whose scowl had softened just enough to carry unspoken words. "We got word," he said, voice low against the whipping wind. "There's talk of a new threat, raiders moving through the hills, not like the cattle rustlers we've dealt with." I nodded slowly. The prairie was wild, and danger rode the wind like a shadow. "They're coming this way," Brody continued. "If they hit your place, it won't be just your cattle at risk." I felt the weight of the news settle over me, heavier than the winter frost. "Nahili and I will be ready," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. That night, we sat by the fire, the warmth a fragile shield against the dark that pressed on every side. I told Nahili about the raiders, watching the flicker of determination ignite in her eyes. "We faced worse," she said softly, voice steady. "Together." We spent hours planning, mapping the land, marking the spots where we could hold ground, where the hills might give us advantage. There was a fierce hope in our whispered words, a silent promise that no matter the storm coming, we would stand side by side. Days passed in a tense rhythm. The animals stirred uneasily, sensing the unrest in the air. The wind carried distant sound beats, voices raised in harsh commands. Then, one cold dawn, the horizon burned with movement. The raiders rode like shadows over the snow, their numbers large and wild, faces masked by scarves and hardened by cruelty. I stood on the porch, rifle ready, Nahili beside me with a bow strung tight, eyes sharp as the frozen air. The battle was a whirlwind, chaotic, fierce, and raw. Bullets tore through the stillness, horses reared and screamed, and the earth seemed to tremble beneath the fury. We fought not just for land or cattle, but for the fragile life we'd built, the bond that had grown from shared pain and unspoken trust. Amidst the chaos, I saw Nahili move like a shadow, swift and deadly, her arrows finding their marks with a silent precision that left even me breathless. She was the wind now, fierce and unrelenting. I fought with everything left in me, driven by the memories of loss that had once threatened to break me, now tempered into a fierce will to protect. The raiders faltered, confusion and fear flickering in their ranks as we stood our ground. One by one, they began to retreat, leaving behind the scarred earth and broken silence. When the dust settled, we stood alone on the porch, bodies aching, breaths heavy in the cold air. Nahili looked at me, her face streaked with grime and resolve. "We did it," she whispered. "No," I corrected, voice rough. "We survived." There was a difference marked by the scars we bore and the strength we found in each other. In the days that followed, the town's attitude shifted. No longer just whispers of suspicion but cautious respect. Brody himself stopped by one afternoon, tipping his hat in a rare gesture of acknowledgement. "Calloway Nahili," he said, voice grudging, "you stood for this land, for all of us." It wasn't an apology, but it was something new, a step toward acceptance in a world that had long been divided. One evening, as the long winter nights settled in, Nahili and I sat by the fire, the silence between us no longer heavy but full. I reached out, taking her hand in mine, a simple gesture that spoke of everything we'd found in each other. She smiled, a soft light in the dark. "We're not alone anymore," she said. "No," I agreed. "Not anymore." The cold months wore on, but inside the cabin, life bloomed in quiet moments, the soft crackle of the fire, the steady rhythm of shared chores, the warmth of a presence that chased away years of loneliness. We were no longer just a man and a girl thrown together by chance. We were a family, forged in fire and ice, bound by loss but driven by hope. As the first hints of spring crept over the horizon, painting the prairie with tentative green, I knew that the hardest battles were behind us. But the journey was far from over. We had found each other in the vastness, built a refuge where once there was only grief. And now, under the endless sky, we faced the future not as broken souls, but as survivors, as fighters, as something new. Together, the world outside might still be harsh and unforgiving, but inside we had found a home, a place where the past no longer defined us, where the wind no longer carried only sorrow, but the promise of new beginnings. The prairie stretched before us, endless and wide, painted in the soft golden hues of early spring, the ice melting away to reveal the earth's quiet awakening. The sky above was a vast canvas, streaked with soft clouds, the promise of warmer days whispered on the gentle breeze. I stood at the edge of the corral, watching Nahili move among the horses, her hands steady, her presence calm and sure, so different from the frightened girl who had once shivered at the train station bench. We had come far, from silence to speech, from fear to trust, from loss to a fragile hope. Our lives intertwined like the braided reins she now held, strong and unbreakable. The ranch was no longer a prison or a monument to grief, it was home. The past few months had been a trial by fire, testing our resolve and our bond in ways I never could have imagined. The raider attack, the town's judgment, the long, cold nights, all etched deep lines on our faces and hearts. But every scar told a story of survival and courage. Every dawn we faced together was a victory over the darkness that once threatened to consume us. I remembered the first time I'd offered her shelter, a gesture born of desperation, of an aching need to protect something fragile and human. Since then, Nahili had become the steady flame that pushed back the cold inside me. She taught me to listen again, to speak again, to feel again, and I gave her a place where she could heal, where the memories of soldiers and sickness could start to lose their sting. The town's grudging acceptance had grown into cautious friendship. People still whispered, but the tone had changed, respect mingled with the suspicion. Even Brody, the sheriff, had softened, no longer just a figure of threat, but a man who recognized what we'd built. One afternoon, I rode into Willow Creek with Nahili by my side. The faces that met us were less hostile now, some even nodding with a reluctant approval. The women, like Martha Higgins, kept their distance, but no longer spat words of condemnation. The general storekeeper greeted us without turning away. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Back at the ranch, the routines of life settled into a comforting rhythm. Nahili learned to handle the cattle with a grace that surprised me, her hands gentle but sure, She cared for the animals as if they were old friends, and I watched with pride as she grew stronger, more confident, her laughter slowly replacing the silence that once filled the cabin. One evening, after a day spent mending fences and feeding horses, we sat by the fire, the room filled with the quiet hum of the prairie night. The air smelled of wood smoke and earth, a scent that now felt like home. I pulled from my pocket the small wooden bird I'd carved for her months ago, a token of hope and connection. "Nahili," I said softly, holding the bird out to her. "You've come a long way." She took it gently, eyes shining with unshed tears. "We both have," she whispered. We sat in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of everything we had shared and lost, full of the future we might build together. But healing was not a straight path. The shadows of the past still crept into our days. Nahili spoke rarely of San Carlos, of the aunt she sought, the family she had lost. I did not press. Some wounds needed time, not words. I still felt the ache for Sarah and my son, their absence a hollow in my chest that no passing season could fill. Yet with Nahili beside me, the weight lessened, replaced by a fierce determination to live, truly live again. Spring deepened, and the land blossomed, wildflowers painting the hillsides in bursts of color. The ranch thrummed with life animals grazing, birds singing, the wind carrying the promise of renewal. One morning, Nahili and I saddled Dusty and rode out across the rolling fields, the sun rising warm on our backs. The wind teased her dark hair, and I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for: peace. As we rode, I spoke softly, words flowing easier than I'd expected. "I used to think this land was a prison," I said. "Now it feels like a promise." She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's a place to remember," she said, "and to forget." We rode on in silence, two figures against the endless sky, bound by shared loss and newfound hope. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the world in shades of orange and purple, we stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the town that had once rejected her and me. I placed a hand on Nahili's shoulder. "We've come home," I said. She smiled, a small, weary smile filled with strength. "Yes," she whispered, "together." Life would never be simple or without hardship. The scars of the past remained, reminders of battles fought and losses endured, but we had learned that the fiercest storms bring the brightest dawns. In each other we found sanctuary, a fragile bloom in the harshest ground. Our story was not just one of survival, but of courage, compassion, and the power to heal. And so, under the vast western sky, with the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and hope, we began the next chapter. No longer broken, no longer alone. Together, we faced the future, a new home, a new life, and the promise of peace. If you were in the main character's place, would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. While you're here, explore the other videos on your screen for more stories like this.